So, as you say, there's so much that I'd like to just have a chat with you about, and I know you've been doing the circuit on exploring the sacred traditions, and in one of your most recent talks, you were talking about the three relationships that you now think that we've lost, which I agree about. It's the relationship with humanity, the relationship with nature, and with the sacred traditions. And I mean, obviously, I became Muslim over 22 years ago now, and and for me, it was really focused on nature, because as a biologist, as a raptor biologist and ecologist, I was working in Saudi Arabia, and I was studying the ecology of vultures, and so I've always understood thinking outside the box, and relationships and systems thinking, and then when I then studied for many years in Africa to become a field guide and tracker. So I was living with the Bushmen. And I suppose then Ian, that was when I really understood about how everything is connected. And I suppose, and then when I began my journey to then want to study to become an imam, I was so shocked that when I studied the Quran, that just about on every page was the command to study, reflect, ponder, think about the cosmos, about the natural world, and so many words. Because to really understand the Islamic scripture, you've got to understand the Arabic language, and so many words, Ian, where the command to think, and really, as you start to look at the whole of the Quran, it's really focused on right brain hemisphere, which is just truly amazing. And then, so when I started to read your first book, the left brain and the right brain hemisphere, that sort of astounded me. And then I was doing some research with, and I think you wrote a little piece. It was by Waqas Ahmed on the polymath.
Yes.
And he brought out a book. And then roughly at the same time, and I keep saying His Royal Highness Prince Charles, but now it's the King.
It is the King.
It is the King, yes. And he brought out a book which not many people know about, and it's called Harmony. And
I do know it. Yes.
And it's a new way of seeing the world. And it's interesting that, and something, because hopefully we can look at how do we go forward. So we know that there's a problem in how we see, how we think, and how we see the world. But the impact was what I was seeing in the book called The Polymath with Waqas and with Charles, King Charles, was a call for a complete revolution, and they were the words that they were saying, which were quite shocking, to actually change the whole system, and to begin this sort of mission of an awareness campaign, which I know you have spoken about. So, I mean, initially, I just wanted your sort of thoughts on that to start with.
Well, yes, of course. Incidentally, I found many commonalities between a philosophy that is rather homegrown, that I sort of built on my early acquaintance with pre-Socratic philosophers mainly, and then with Chinese philosophers and so on. I found many correspondences really in a way they are asking us to do something quite similar, really, and I'm not saying that they all boil down to the same thing, but they're clearly they have a common aim, which is to take us away from this very reduced vision that we are liable to, particularly nowadays, good heavens, of what it is that the world is and what a human is and how they relate and what we're doing here, you know. I was talking to a World Summit in AI in Amsterdam last week, and for some reason, they asked me to give a sort of headline speech. And I thought, well, I'm not really your man to sort of talk a great deal about AI. But what I tried to do was to show that unless we're very careful, although AI might be a very helpful tool to us in certain ways, we must be careful not to be driven by it into a sort of way of thinking which is very abstract and manipulative. So, yes, I agree about all of that. And I think the thing that's difficult to convey to people unless they've already seen it for themselves is this idea of a new way of using our minds and our hearts, really. And it sounds rather vague. It sounds a little bit airy-fairy. But it's of profound importance, and people want me to say what we need to do is the following half dozen things. And I immediately realized that by saying that, I'm reducing the whole business to a few things that we can tick off a list. But it's not that I'm talking about. It's not that, as I understand it, any of the great spiritual traditions are talking about. They are talking about a revolution, if you like, in our hearts and in our souls, in which we see with different eyes. And in the Christian tradition, there is this image of St. Paul, not actually my favorite figure in Christian history, but there we are. But he had this moment of vision in which he was blinded and suddenly saw the world with new eyes. And I think that at least is a good image of what it is that needs to happen.
And it's interesting because when, if you sort of go back, because what I'm trying to do, Ian, is because I'm sort of facing many obstacles, particularly with, should we say, the Muslim world. In many parts of the world and with many scholars, they tend to make things very sort of black and white.
Yes.
And
yes.
but thankfully, what I'm trying to do is to explain the rich history of the Islamic civilizations. And I'm pleased to say how some scholars see the world through different lens, but actually through the correct lens. Because if you just go back to should we say, the story of Islam, when the Prophet was in Mecca, and he was in deep love with God, but because of the society around him, and you could say like what we experience today in Western civilization, he just couldn't connect. So he had to go off grid. He had to make that retreat to the cave. And that's where, in a lot of my study throughout the world, with some great scholars, I sort of connected very much to the tasawwuf, the spiritual aspect, which is very key in the Prophet's life. And it was while he was in the cave that he was reflecting and thinking about the natural world. And as some of the great scholars say, Ian, it must have been at such a level of deep contemplation and consciousness awareness that then that first command came to him from God, which was Iqra, read. And I sort of looked at that in a way, well, how could he read and what could he read? Because, we understand that he was illiterate and he couldn't read or write. And then the more you study, and the research shows now that it was a command from God to the Prophet now you've been studying, you've been reflecting, and you've been connecting to the cosmos, the natural world, which is like a book to be read. Connect that now with a revelation, which is systems thinking, and now deliver that message to the whole of mankind. And that really, once I started to study that under some of the great scholars, it really changed my whole sort of life. And we're at a point where I'm trying to deliver that message to many Muslims and scholars and institutes now around the world, because what you write about, it's so profound, because it's there throughout the Quran. It's there throughout the Islamic history. And I think if you just look at what we think of as the golden age in Spain, in Andalusia and Cordoba and Iraq, is
yes.
That was the period, and this is why I was also interested in the polymath. That was the period where the Islamic scholars were not that we think of today, just the imam. They were the scientists and the pharmacists, and they were the chemists. They were the architects and the doctors, and they were the great scholars. And as in the book, Biologist, he's calling out, and in the same way as the king is, a return to that sort of way of thinking. And that's where I see this amazing connection in your work, because you start off by saying that the left brain is trying to become the master of the right brain, and then your new book on things. It's
the matter with things. Yes.
It's how you now look at what we say is the different levels of Islamic contemplation. So how can you, how would I connect with someone who is Muslim to go through that process of rewiring to change? And it's about connecting with someone's senses first, and then to tune into nature, and then to start to see relationships and patterns. It's that sort of field of the Islamic tradition that sadly not many people know about.
Yes. And I have to admit that I'm no scholar of Islam, but what has always appealed to me immensely is Sufism and the poets such as Rumi and so forth. So it's been more what I would think of as the right hemispheric aspects of Islam, because Islam, like Christianity, has adherents who think in very rigid ways, and it seems to me quite left hemispheric. These are the rules, and it's all written here, and if you disagree with this, then there's no hope for you. Whereas I think that in reality, one is always in what to use a phrase from the English mystical tradition, in a cloud of unknowing. One is reaching out towards and seeking for the divine and finding it, if one is lucky, on a path. It's not something that's already given to you. It's something you have to find, and that process is a constantly resonant and responsive one, in which you and whatever it is that is other than us, the world and the divine realm, are responding to you as you are responding to it. So I think in all these places we see both a tradition that seems to me to have perhaps too much of the left hemispheric in it, and another tradition that really is quite the opposite of this. And it usually tends to be amongst those who are termed in the West anyway mystics, which always has a sort of sound as though it's somehow I don't know, not quite real, but of course it is the real, whereas our sort of sets of rules and our representations of the world are not the true living presence of it. The representation is just like a map. It hasn't the life that the real thing has. And so the experience of religion is in these often very beautiful but quite hard to understand verses and sayings that immediately seem to be pregnant with meaning, but one has to get away from the idea that everyday language, everyday logic is going to be able to answer these questions. There are things that are deeper than that. And there's nothing strange about that. I mean, almost anybody of whatever religion will know what I mean by talking about the way in which poetry or music works on us. None of it can be made explicit. If you try to make it explicit, you reduce it to almost nothing. But it's still very real. And anybody who's even been in love knows that there are experiences that are as important as anything that can happen to you. But they can't be seen, they can't be measured, and they can't be transcribed into the written word unless one is a very skillful poet.
Yes. And something that I think sadly that we see across the Muslim world is I suppose since the sort of the birth of Western civilization around the 16th and 17th century, where we're just seeing everything through that linear perspective, that reductionist way is, if you look before the 16th and 17th century, where the Muslim world was very rich and it was definitely predominantly, seeing everything through the right brain hemisphere. Of course, the left is there. But I just feel that since I'm part of my research is trying to work out. So when did that break in the Islamic world? When did we transfer from the right to the left? And again, like what you say, it really stems from the birth of Western civilization. And sadly today, if you look at the majority of mosques and the institutes, how they teach is very much like the modern education system. It's still focused on that left brain side.
Well, as you know, in The Master and His Emissary, I do look back to what one might call the birth of Western civilization, the ancient Greek civilization, although, of course, there were others before, Egyptian and Babylonian and so forth, but in the Eastern Mediterranean area, but Greek civilization and Roman civilization, which are clearly pretty much would be thought of anyway as parts of Western civilization, although they learnt enormously from the East, and there's always been commerce between East and West, that these civilizations did follow a path, unfortunately, with swings one way and corrections and so forth, but ineluctably towards a more left hemispheric vision, after which the civilization basically fell apart. So what concerns me at the moment is that if we carry on thinking in this very simplified way, it doesn't bode well for our civilization either. But I think that there's always these trends and tendencies. The reason I refer back a couple of thousand years is that these tendencies are there. After all, they're in us, in our brains, and it's a question of balancing these. And my reflections on that are that the more that we are removed from the natural world, the more that we are uprooted, partly by mobility and by other things, from the sort of rootedness of a culture and its complicated and subtle history with its myths and its stories, the more that we see ourselves as isolated individuals, not parts of society, and we see humans not as part of nature, but somehow stuck down in the middle of what's called the environment, as though it's just something around you that's there for you to exploit. The more that these things go on, and the more we reject, because of a misplaced sense that science has told us that there is nothing except the material. I mean, science has told us nothing of the kind. But when people believe these things, then they turn their backs on, and by modern urban civilization are more or less compelled to turn their backs on things that would have led them back naturally to a sense of the wonderful, complexly interrelated, beautiful nature of the cosmos. Instead, they see something that is a bunch of random stuff that has no meaning. And one answer to that, of course, is to run right into the arms of the left hemisphere, to say, I'm so petrified by this, I want something that tells me in black and white, I want all the rules, put them down here, and then I follow them, rather as a computer or a machine would follow these rules. But that is also not to open your heart to the spirit of what is in that religious tradition, be it Christian or be it Islam.
Yes.
Or any other. Yes.
Yeah. And I know that in a number of your talks, when you sort of look in the way that we're sort of going, very much like what King Charles has said, that the more that it's day by day, I sort of fear that we're just heading now to total destruction, which concerns me. The further we're going to be disconnected from humanity, from the natural world, and certainly the divine. It's. Do you feel that the left brain hemisphere is it's that clear mission to separate the divine from? So,
I mean, the left hemisphere doesn't know what it is. It doesn't know. I mean, it is literally less insightful, less perceptive, less intelligent than the left hemisphere. And that's what the first 400 pages of my new book, The Matter with Things, explain in enormous detail with an enormous amount of scientific backing, if you like. The left hemisphere sees less, understands less, is less able to comprehend. And so it's a matter of urgency that we stop capitulating to its extremely meager vision of what is there. It sees only this little diagram, this map, this theory it has. It doesn't any longer respond to experience. And when I hear voices raised against science and against reason, I'm as worried by them as by anything, because science and reason can't answer all our questions, but they are useful signposts on our journey towards whatever is real. The important thing is they can't take us all the way, but they're nonetheless very valuable guides to what is real and truthful as far as they can go. So I'm very concerned about all of this, but I also think that we can't really predict the future. It doesn't look terribly good, I have to admit. But then, certainly in terms of spiritual life, there have been times in the past when there have been great revolutions over fairly short periods in which people have felt the barrenness, the emptiness of where they were, and something else has sort of welled up, often, unfortunately, accompanied by a degree of destruction. But one hopes not in this case, that it could be a right hemisphere revolution, one that was compassionate and humble rather than full of its own importance and full of certainty. So I think these things can happen. And one good thing is that when I talk to young people and when I talk in public, young people often come up to me and say, what you say seems so real to me and seems so important, and what do you think we can do about it? And of course, they're looking for a few pointers, understandably. It's quite hard to give those, as I say, without giving the impression that I think that just by having a new education policy, we will save the world. I don't think that's right, though I think that education is incredibly important, and I think it's lost its way. So certainly education is part of it. Certainly taking steps to stop destroying the beauty and the biodiversity of this wonderful planet that we live on are important. But if we don't change our way of thinking and our way of feeling, if we don't change in our hearts and minds, to use a bit of a cliche, but it is effectively what we need, unless we make those changes, all the rest will be vain, really, because we'll still be the same self-centered, dissatisfied, greedy, left hemisphere dominated people. We need to find a balance which will bring with it a sense of wonder, a sense of awe, a sense of humility, really, about what we do know and what we need further to know, which is a very fine feeling. It's not a terrible disrespect to humanity to feel that there are limits to what we know. It's the only way in which we can sensibly make steps towards knowing more. So I think these are the ways that we can help people forward, by showing them there is another way of looking at the world. And that's what I aim to do through my books. I've devoted most of my time in the last 20 or 30 years, particularly since I stopped seeing patients, to writing in such a way as to convey what it is I'm trying to say. But there are many good things I want to hand over to young people. This morning I was talking to something called the Festival of Hope, and talking to a couple of very bright young people, 16 years old, from the international schools, and talking about, and they feel these things, they see these things too, and they're quite critical of the way modern education works. They see the problems. So there are a lot of people who see what's wrong. The extraordinary thing is that we carry on doing the very things that we know are not any good.
That's funny. I mean, that's what King Charles was saying when he had been interviewed just before he took over. That, he said it's got to a position now where it's been so much talking, but no one's doing anything. And I think just when I just look at him, and he was explaining to me that the reason why, Muhammed, I wrote the book is because people have been thinking for many years that I'm crazy when I look at architecture and I look at organic farming and the education system. I mean, because very clearly in his book, he says we're in a crisis of perception of how we see, how we actually see the world. And I really hope that now he's in this position that he's given the opportunity to still drive what he wants to forward, because I mean now he's given me the opportunity, because obviously one of my main roles, Ian, is I'm head of chaplaincy in the prison service.
Yes.
And so and I know you were talking about it the other day, the increase, not just obviously in crime, but in mental illness and anger. The anger that is present. It is present so much, and that's something that the sacred traditions of the past, understood. It's about looking at the four elements and how everything is in balance or out of balance. So my sort of role within the prison service is to try and bring the natural world in to the prison. To try and help them, and I'm not sure if you sit there was a time where, if we looked at the East was a world of spiritualism and that holistic thinking, but to me now we're having that transition where that life is coming to the West. Do you see that now rising more so in the West? And the Western civilization and the secularization is now taken over more in the East?
Well, yes, thank you for raising that. All my life I've been a huge admirer of the Far East, particularly of China and Japan. As it happens, my grandfather lived in Japan before the First World War, and so when I was very young, he impressed on me many things about the Japanese way of thinking, their amazing aesthetics, and their sense of honor and so forth. I found this all wonderful. And I've always thought that the salvation for the West would come from being able to learn from the East. But certainly in the case of China, it's taken really the most terrible plunge into the worst kind of totalitarianism and materialism that I had hoped they might have avoided. But so it's better that at least voices here are able to see and talk about these things. And I hope that one day China will be true to its ancient spirit, and this can be seen as an aberration. However, I worry because of the advances of AI that may be a difficult thing to bring back. But anyway, yes, I think, you talked about Prince Charles, or King Charles as he now is, and he has, all my life, when it's true, people were ready to dismiss or sideline the things that he talked about, I thought he's seeing the important things, and in the course of time he's turned out to be prophetic. I mean, the things that he believed in and thought were important, we're now seeing are important. He was one of the first people to understand the importance of ecology in the public sphere, and even his ideas about relating to plant life and to trees and so on, which brought a certain amount of amusement and ridicule at the time, are now by no means ridiculous at all. I mean, they show that he sensed something which has a basis, in fact, in science. So that there is life in and communication between and consciousness in the living world. And indeed, I believe, I don't know about you, Muhammed, but I believe that consciousness is fundamental in the cosmos. It is not something that emerged out of the human brain or out of any brain, but is currently being sort of filtered by my brain, by your brain, and by other brains into the shapes that make my consciousness, your consciousness, and so on. But that consciousness is foundational in the universe. And what would you say about that?
Yes, I mean, that was my sort of next question is to ask you, do you believe, or what's your view on collective consciousness? And there's a verse in the Quran where God says that everything, even stones, worship me and praise me, but in ways and languages that you cannot comprehend.
Yes.
So
that's wonderful.
I mean, yes, and in the Islamic tradition, it's about the human being returning to its natural state.
Right.
And to me, what is it that draws that human being towards the ocean, towards a forest, towards a mountain? It's to be amongst the living organisms, the creation of the Creator, that is continually praising, God, and that's what creates that harmony. And so, when I look at now, how physicists are saying that the geometrical patterns is just what we see in the physical world, but then there's the vibration and the energy and the resonance. And now the research is showing that the human heart resonates at the same frequency as the earth. And that to me is a way forward of trying to reach out to people to help to help them think and everything. Have you? There's an organization in America called I forget what it's called now, but that's where they are saying now that through the study of the heart, that the heart also has a brain, that the heart thinks.
Yes. Is this heart math? I think it's called.
Yes.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you've raised a number of things, but immediately on that, when I was in medical school, it was pointed out that there were a lot of nerve fibers running from the brain to the heart, and that made sense because the brain controlled the heart, apparently. But there were also a lot of fibers that ran back from the heart to the brain. This was a bit of an embarrassment. What were they doing? And one suggestion was that they're pain fibers. Well, there are things called C fibers, which are pain fibers, but by no means all the, as we call it, afferent fibers from the heart to the brain were involved in pain. And the gut, of course, is another extraordinary thing. There are more neurons in the human gut than there are in the brain of a dog, an intelligent animal. And they're not all just there to enable peristalsis in your gut. So these are interesting questions. I think that we think and feel with our whole self, which includes our whole embodied self, which contains memory and knowledge that we can access indirectly, but when we limit ourselves to what we can consciously express, then we automatically close down a great field of unconscious knowledge and wisdom which are available to us through being embodied beings, not brains in a vat. So all of that I agree with. And what I find interesting is, and I think the idea of frequencies of resonation is important. I don't know much about synchronization between the heart and the earth or anything like that, but I do know that all experience is in fact of a kind of resonance, and all energetic processes are not unidirectional or linear as they might have seemed in the Newtonian universe, but are matters of vibration, reverberation, relations in which each part affects the other, and something new comes out of this because each is changed by the encounter. I believe that all experience is like this, that all experience is actually an encounter between my consciousness, your consciousness, whatever it is, and the greater consciousness of the cosmos. So all of those things I agree with, and I've been thinking about the inanimate world as well, and of course sentiments very similar to those that you described in the Quran are in the Psalms, where the hills and the seas and so on rejoice before the Lord and so on. And this sense that the whole cosmos is animate is something I think that is very important. And at the moment I'm reading, I've been generously allowed to read pre-publication the manuscript of Jude Currivan's latest book. Jude Currivan is a physicist who's written very interestingly about what she calls the holographic universe. But in what I have read so far, she is describing the what we would think of as inanimate world, the world before life emerged on this planet, in terms that are utterly extraordinary in the sense of their organized purposiveness, really, the way in which things are clearly moving in ways that have meaning, not randomly. And I'm not, of course, saying that this is all an engine that is being controlled by a divine engineer. I don't see whatever we mean by God as being an engineer. I see God as being that sacred divine ground of everything that is that in which everything lives and in which God lives. So in any case, what I'm really saying there in brief is that I think that it's a mistake to think that there is a hard and fast line between the animate and the inanimate. I think that whereas you can't get consciousness out of matter if you consider matter to be entirely unconscious, you can get life out of inanimacy. Indeed, that's mainstream biology. But also that what's going on in the inanimate world has many of the features that go on in the animate world, except just to a very, very, very much lesser degree and much, much, much more slowly. So I think the inanimate world responds to what there is in the cosmos more slowly and less profoundly than living things do. And the advent of life takes everything a whole, billionfold more rapid and more intense, this connection with, and response to whatever is of value in the cosmos.
Yes, yes. And I think it's it's true, isn't it, that if we go back and we look at the great civilizations, the traditions that that their whole way of life was connected to the cosmos, the natural world, and the energy fields, and it's just truly, to me, amazing.
Yes,
and that's what we need to me, return to.
and it's mainstream physics. The things that we think of as particles, which is the nearest thing we get to envisaging the basis of things in physics, that looks like a thing. That particle is in fact a field of energy that under certain circumstances manifests to us as a particle. But nonetheless, the origin of everything is in fields of energy, and that matter is interchangeable with energy. E equals mc squared tells us that.
Yes, yes. And just lastly, Ian, and thank you very much indeed for your time, is the way forward. Do you hope at some stage, when you look at the three missing relationships, people and nature and the sacred, do you foresee that one of your aims is to bring the sacred traditions and leaders together, and try and work with how you're going to try and take things forward?
Gosh, well, that would be an ambition and a half, but it would be a worthy one. I mean, I would love to see the awareness dawn in people's minds that the barriers we set up between one another are unnecessary. Let us delight in differences, of course, but they don't mean barriers, Everything doesn't have to be homogeneous and the same in order for us to be able to welcome one another in a spirit of, there's more here than we know in this world, and we all have gifts of seeing things differently. We don't need to fight with one another over this. Above all, we shouldn't abuse one another over it. Show compassion to one another, see different sides to questions, and see if we cannot move forward towards something more creative. I think we can do it. I believe we have it in us, and it's our choice whether we want to go the path of drowning out other voices, shouting people down, being certain that we know, or the path of greater humility and awe before the world and before one another, whereby we show how to work together, because it's through that working together, not only that we will be able to improve the world, but that even if we weren't able to do that, the very business of working together will be fulfillment of our humanity. We're not fulfilled by getting and grabbing the aims of the left hemisphere. We're fulfilled through working together, side by side, trusting one another, sharing one another's lives, sharing one another's feelings. That is the fulfillment of a human life.
100%. Yeah, and that's a wonderful way to end. And just from me, Ian, I really hope that we can touch base soon, and with all your other colleagues in the sacred traditions, that maybe in the future we can come together and work.
I very much hope that's the case. Thank you very much, Muhammed. Yes. And I hope that maybe we can also come together on the projects that the former prince, now the king, has had dear to his heart.
Thank you much indeed, Ian. And take care of yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammed, and same to you. Thank you for joining me and spending time talking with me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.